All right. So now that we've talked about how to identify your buy box for acquisition, what types of businesses to buy, we've run through SDE and EBITDA, the SIMs, reviewing an LOI. I want to now talk about how the actual structure looks like for buying a M&A deal and how to structure it properly. All right. So the key thing is that there is a specific way that we highly recommend in order for you, oh, sorry about that, in order for you to be able to buy a business, right? And so the way that we refer to it is the 80-10-10 rule. So it's technically the way that a lot of, SBA backed acquisitions occur and allows you to leverage basically the highest amount of debt while making it in a smart manner, right? So the way that we do that typically is we're taking about 80% senior debt. Sorry, I guess I should not click on it. 10% seller note, and then 10% equity. So let's go into a little bit more of what that means and how that actually works out. That's the 80-10-10 rule, right? So ultimately, this allows you to buy a business for only kind of 10% out of pocket. And I'll actually even talk about how you can get it down to 5% later on by using a forgivable seller note, because those are kind of some tactics that you can do to reduce your equity injection. But that's how you can see why this is such an interesting method, because you can buy $1 million business and only have to put down 50 to 100K. And of course, you can even have outside equity capital, investor capital come in. But in general, you can see how you can properly take advantage of leverage to buy a smart, sustainable, cash flowing business without having to buy, put 100% of the cash down. All right. So that's where the 80-10-10 comes into play. So 80% of it, right, comes from the actual SBA or the senior debt. And so typically we'll use the SBA 7A program, which we'll talk about later on in the course on how to raise debt for the deal. But by utilizing the 80% debt, this structure basically minimizes the need for personal capital, and it helps maximize the, available financing that you'll need. So that's definitely a good way to think about it ultimately. Now, the next step after that is what you're doing is you're basically taking a 10% seller note. So sometimes this can be higher, right? And this is where the portion of the purchase price is financed by the seller. So they're basically becoming upgraded to the bank, and they're going to be either getting some interest or they're going to be okay with basically taking on that level of debt, for example. So just something to keep in mind, because that's typically speaking what you'll go for. And so sometimes it can be higher, definitely. It doesn't have to just be limited to 10%, but ultimately you want to just be wary that the SBA 7A loan, the senior debt that you're going to take, you're going to put that all under like a 10-year loan. So what that means, right, is that it's kind of like even in real estate, where as long as you can kind of leverage the debt and have the kind of tenants pay off your mortgage, you're still, even if you're not increasing in cash flow or anything, you're still building equity in the home, right, or in the real estate. Same thing here, where this is an amazing tool where even if you're not able to grow the business, in the worst case scenario, you keep the business the same, you're building equity in it and being able to utilize paying off the debt to build additional equity into the business. And then the last 10% is the actual kind of own investor capital or own equity. So that's what you'll have to put in. And so if you're able to get a forgivable seller note, which again we'll talk about more in depth later on in the course, but the forgivable seller note basically, sorry, not this forgivable seller note, but seller note on full standby. And so what that means is that if you have a seller note on full standby, that means that basically it's not going to kick in. There's not going to be any payments made for the first 2 years, right? So basically, the SBA wants to make sure that if it's on that if you are going to reduce the amount of equity injection you're putting in and you're not putting 10% down, some lenders will kind of be okay with 3% or 5%, because then typically they're going to be, they're not out on risk of putting, 90% or 80% debt fully. They know that some of the business is going to be financed by the seller. And so it means that no payments will be made during that period. So typically, that's usually the first 2 years after the business acquisition closes. And even though no payments are made to the business seller during the standby period, interest will still accrue on the outstanding principal. So basically the reason the SBA is okay with that tactic to be able to reduce the equity injection that you're putting in is because you're not going to be paying the seller note in the first 2 years. They'll know that you'll have time to stabilize the cash flows and take over the business and transition it and hopefully grow it and get your hands around it. So it gives them the comfort and breathing room knowing that you'll have the right cash flow to pay off their debt and not be worried about kind of competing with the debt that you might have with the seller as well. So that's kind of the key way. And we're going to go into depth about how to raise the debt, how to raise the equity, how to, kind of structure the deal. But I wanted to lay out the full picture for you guys in terms of this is probably the structure we're going to be talking about throughout the course. And this is one of the most common ones. So mentally, you can start picturing, okay, how, if I'm trying to take down a large deal, a $5 million deal, this is how you'll kind of work around the mechanics between how much is debt, how much is equity, and how much is your own personal money put in. So again, it's all flexible, but this is kind of an initial baseline that we can work off of going forward.